called Carolee Schneemann, and how it relates to Deleuze. So, throughout his work, Deleuze is fascinated by figures of self-destructive creativity, the madness and drug abuse of Artaud and Nietzsche, the alcoholism of Fitzgerald and Lowry. And although Deleuze is constantly cautioning the artist that he or she must unleash the literary power of the event, but without falling into nihilism, he simultaneously seems to be willing the cracks to appear, his fantastic abysses of nonsense. In Essays Critical and Clinical, he says, "The writer returns from what he has seen and heard with bloodshot eyes and pierced eardrums. What health would be sufficient to liberate life wherever it is imprisoned, by and within man, by and within organisms and genera?" And it's definitely a fine balance. The artist's special access to the plane of immanence is definitely a mixed blessing. This task of differentiating its unmediated flux and flow and liberating life from repressive forms seems to necessitate at least a little bit of madness, or produce the artist as a little bit of a schizophrenic. And of course, the greater the ordeal, the finer the creation. Time and time again, Deleuze reveals himself to be enamoured of the artists who fail to make it back. Vincent van Gogh and Jack Karouac, for example. Deleuze addresses this point with relation to painting and the very particular danger of this creative medium to the psyche of the artist in The Logic of Sensation, his book about Francis Bacon. In the other arts, catastrophe is only associated, but painters must pass through the catastrophe themselves, embrace the chaos and attempt to emerge from it. The catastrophe is the recurrent and traumatic moment of chaos at the beginning of painting, when, having covered the canvas in the first sort of hasty, non-representational marks, the artist suddenly finds him or herself faced with this as yet unmediated immanence and the enormity of the task that is ahead. It's the moment in which the painting either succeeds, harnessing the chaos and unlocking hidden dimensions of sensation, or fails, reverting to representational cliches. Or worse still, the painting never recovers from the chaos of these free marks. Painter, and indeed painting, remain mired in a state of catastrophe. So the medium I'm particularly interested in is performance arts. And this notion of the creative ordeal would seem to be particularly pertinent. Mediating the flow of immanence with their own physical bodies without even the distance of a paintbrush, the performance artists are surely at greater risk from these physical and psychical detriments of immanence. The catastrophe that they must pass through is the vectors of forces and effective vibrations crashing into the physical body. In particular, I'm thinking of artists such as Brisley and McMullen, whose performance between was a Sisyphean labour in which they struggled naked up and down a slippery slope for 48 hours. And Marina Abramovich's Rhythm 2 performance, where she took convulsive and then catatonic drugs to explore the boundaries of consciousness. And these are fairly extreme examples of the medium and the sort often described as ordeal art. But this piece that I want to talk about certainly has resonances of these. It consisted of the artist Carolee Schneemann suspended from a rope in a white sort of prepared performance space. She was on a pulley, so she was able to sort of haul herself up and down, and in her hand she had chalks, which is sort of marking the field with, marking sort of the limits and the extensions of the body in space. The specific tension and violence of the piece comes from the fluctuating systolic and diastolic dimensions of a body both in control of and in submission to the forces acting upon it, so gravity, contortion, balance, manifested in a relentless display of swinging, collapsing, rising, dropping, crashing. There's certainly something of the catastrophe about it. So this idea of the body as a manifestation of forces, like a physicality that's on the edge of pure immanence, can also be understood in terms of Deleuze's concept of the figure. Deleuze explicates the notion of the figure through the paintings of Francis Bacon. It is the minimum of pictorial form necessary within the painted composition, so it's neither abstract nor fully representational, but giving enough form to the painted marks that affect, or in painting sensation, can be transmitted. So in Bacon, it's these sort of deformed, distorted, figure-like images, the human body, but not the representation of a person as such, and isolated from all object relations and narrative, allowing the figure to be in a purely intensive relationship with the composition. And as this minimum of form, it's the figure that emerges at the moment of the catastrophe, and as such it has a clear relationship with becoming, and particularly the viscerality of Artaud's body without organs. And Deleuze says, "The figure is the body without organs. The body without organs is flesh and nerve. A wave flows through it and traces levels upon it. A sensation is produced when the wave encounters the forces acting upon the body, an effective athleticism, a scream breath. When sensation is linked to a body in this way, it ceases to be representative and becomes real. And cruelty will be less and less linked to the representation of something horrible and will become nothing other than the action of forces upon the body. I would argue that this is clearly central to the condition of performance art, simply because the performance artist, who is physically and bodily on the brink of immanence, is the figure. Within the boundaries of a performance, but freed from the task of representation, the performance artist's body no longer relates to a person or an identity, but neither is it acting out a role in the way a theatrical performing artist does. Instead, it becomes an assemblage of. And the medium of performance would seem to have a special relationship with Deleuzean becoming. Unlike sculpture, film and painting, the other visual arts which have a historic connection to mimetic processes, performance has always been about the immediate presentation of bodies, in which there is no time lapse between production and product. Performance exists as a singular event, which is not a representation, but a manifestation. And as a result, performance has no endpoint. By its time-based nature, it just happens and then ends, a process without a product. It's like Deleuze and Guattari describe the line of modern painting that has freed itself from representation. They say, "This line is without origin, since it is always beginning off the painting which holds it by the middle, it is without coordinates." This then is a space of performance, which holds a line of flight by the middle, and is a space of becoming in that it never actually becomes anything, it simply disappears or becomes imperceptible. And I really feel that up to including her limits, this is another still from it, is an exemplification of this. Because to start with, it isn't about anything other than the pure relations of movements between the artist-performer and the prepared space in which she's performing. The physical principle of a seismograph or a Ouija board comes to mind. Schneemann has also said that this piece was done as a direct result of the abstract expressionist painting of Jackson Pollock. But that's not to say that this is about painting in any narrative sense, nor that it's a performance of painting. But the relationship between the two must be a becoming painting, in that this performance, is a zone of indiscernibility where the specific relations of force and movement between body and space find proximity with those of the pictorial figure and field. And Schneemann, as a figural performer in this becoming painting, is not imitating the paintbrush or the pencil. Rather, she's entering a zone or a block of proximity between the recognisable terms of body and pencil, an assemblage. She is a body pencil. And pencil is an interesting motif because, like the figural body, it is in submission to the forces that act upon it. So the downward pressure from a higher force, the pull of gravity, and mark making, which is the violent index of the collision of body with surface. And as body pencil, Schneemann becomes this strange combination, as if the controlling force of the artist's hand had dissolved down into the pencil, creating this sort of auto-responsive machine that won't write or draw anything representative, but would respond immanently to the forces passing through it. So she says that her performance was done as a direct result of Jackson Pollock, but what exactly does this mean? Certainly, Pollock was a central figure in the history of painting. He jolted it out of representation and scandalised the art world by introducing the gestural body, the first movements perhaps in artists becoming pencil. But it was only the first tentative steps in a direction that really finds its culmination in Schneemann. The disparity between the two can be seen if we look at two quotes. So Pollock, on the one hand, says about his work, "On the floor I am more at ease. I feel nearer, more a part of the painting, since this way I can walk around it, work from four sides, literally be in the painting." Whereas Schneemann later will say about her work, "A sense of dormant planes on which unexpected equivalences converge, jostle, flow, impinge, diverge, gather momentum, fade, shift, homologous to the body rope marking connections. Only thought is to be an extension of the rope itself. Until discomfort or loss of concentration, I function as pencil." The answer to the relationship between the two can perhaps be found in Deleuze's comparison of Velázquez's Portrait of Innocent X with Francis Bacon's study after Velázquez's Portrait of Innocent X. Clearly, the latter is a direct result of the former. So in looking at these two, Deleuze points out the sort of the uncanny figural direction being taken by Velázquez, the meat-like curtain in the background, the throne which is already beginning to isolate the figure, but points out that all this is strangely restrained. It is something that is going to happen, but not yet acquired the ineluctable, irrepressible presence of the Bacons. Perhaps Pollock's canvases too have a sense that something is being held back by the abstract expressionist lines, something that has yet to happen. For it is the figure, this emergent form, that is absent from the Pollock and is the irrepressible presence of the Schneemann. Deleuze says, presence, presence, this is the first word that comes to mind. Could this presence be hysterical? The hysteric is at the same time someone who imposes his or her presence, but also someone for whom things and beings are present, and who attributes to everything and communicates to every being this excessive presence. And hysteria is indeed the clinical specificity of figural painting, in that it attempts, through the figure, to release all the presence that is trapped beneath the represence of forms that have dominated narrative painting. So, up to and including her limits, isn't a response to Pollock. It's not a tribute, a reformulation or a feminist answer. It's a hystericization of Pollock. So, in the immediacy of the performer's body, artist, performer, figure and pencil are rolled into a single polyvalent body without organs. This is far more than the dribbling arm of Pollock the painter, who, although he feels himself to be in the painting, is still just sort of skirting around the sides. His drippings are not yet the auto-ejected marks of Schneemann's body pencil. And crucially with Pollock, we still have a gap between the painting process and the painted product. So although we call it process painting, the process nonetheless remains largely hidden. It's very much a means to a plastic end. You know, his canvases are hung in MoMA in New York. With the Schneemann, on the other hand, everything comes to the surface in one sort of convulsive moment. Producer, production and product are collapsed into a singular hysterical event. The entire feat of painting becomes visible, including everything that's meant to stay hidden. So the struggle with chaos, the oscillation between success and failure, the originary emergence of the figure from the artist's accidental gestural marks, and even the flesh of the artist with which she is also life model. What is vibratory figure on one level becomes artist-performer at another. Pencil becomes mark-making, becomes figure, becomes field, in an absolutely non-sequential traversing of the planes of painting. This is the hysterical transition of organs within the body without organs, the assemblage of the entire piece which discovers its materiality, its molecularity, and eventually its moment of dissipation. So, where does all this hysteria leave the very real, very psychological artist, Carolee Schneemann? Ironically, it is with this hystericization of Pollock that she is able to remain critical and not clinical, whilst Pollock himself cannot escape the catastrophe of painting or the clinical catastrophe of his own self-destructive life. The painter, Deleuze points out, never begins with a blank canvas, because the whole history of narrative and representational painting means that every blank canvas is already utterly invested with the cliches and pre-pictorial givens about what is supposed to be there, so what we expect to see on the canvas. The initial act of painting then has to be the eradication of these cliches, to cover them over with these quick manual marks. So the first act of painting, which leads to the moment of catastrophe, which leads to, all being well, the emergence of the figure as this effective third way of figural painting. What this means, though, is that this task of facing the catastrophe has much higher stakes than just the success of the image. Because the artist will have in his or her mind's eye an assumption or an idea about what is going to be painted, i.e. a cliche, the artist is actually already a part of these pre-pictorial givens and must, in essence, paint him or herself out of the canvas. The painter's problem, Deleuze says, is not how to enter the canvas, since he is already there, but how to get out of it. It's now apparent that up to and including her limits is not only becoming painting, but is caught in a complex and crucial moment of painting. Schneemann, who is literally the painter within the painting, is at the point of making these first marks on the canvas wall field that lead to the emergence of the figure. And this figure is also herself as a figural performer. She is the originary becoming form of the figure, solidifying from the abstract marks, but this movement of emergence in one direction is also simultaneously the movement of disappearance of the artist in the other direction. So it is as though every mark that she's making on the wall is both an entrance and an exit point, a vanishing point through which a process of translocation is taking place, in which the figure gradually replaces the artist. Pollock's misfortune, perhaps, is that he never managed this, because the figure never emerges in abstract expressionism. Sensation is attained, says Deleuze, but remains in an irremediably confused state. Well, this is the very plight of the schizophrenic, who cannot differentiate and is bombarded by unmediated sensation. Pollock sadly had no means of escape other than, of course, the alcohol-fueled car crash that killed him in 1955. Schneemann, on the other hand, is not a hysteric. The moment of her performance piece is just this turning point, when the artist has faced the absolutely self-destructive chaos of the abyss and is about to return, escaping the hysteria of her own materiality by painting in the figure. She does indeed go up to and including her limits. She looks over the edge into the schizophrenic crack, or rather across the vast expanse of the hysterical surface. An endurance artist who will return from what she has done, bruised and bleeding, and with the marks of immanence and materiality upon her, but she will return. Finally, the clues to this are in the title of this strangely detached, impersonal, up to and including her limits. In Thousand Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari talk about the particular semiotic of becoming, its grammatical tense being the infinitive verb, and its article being the third person indefinite, a semiotic combination that gives a sense of non-pulsed, non-specific time, such as once upon a time or a child is being beaten. It's that chain of semiotic. Free from personal determination. But Deleuze and Guattari say, we believe on the contrary that the third person indefinite, he, they, implies no indetermination from this point of view. It ties the statement to a collective assemblage as its necessary condition rather than to the subject of an enunciation. So, up to and including her limits, infinitive plus third person indefinite. Indefinite in that, like the figure, it has nothing to do with personal pronouns, and infinitive because the time of becoming is the endless and formless duration of aeon rather than the representational time of chronos. So we could suggest that in this performance and in her particular role as an artist, Carolee Schneemann has entered a block of smooth space-time which allows her to tap into an assemblage of painter, paintbrush and painting. But most importantly, it is with this third person, her limits, that she maintains a performance space that is apersonal, collective, and allows her not to take the catastrophe personally. So these aren't her limits per se, because that would send her mad. Sorry, I lost my space. Yeah, so not her limits per se, because that really would send you mad. But the third person her, which is a minimum of form that allows her to be physically very present, but actually remain very detached, to explore a tendency that need not be detrimental to herself. A tendency, I would argue, explored by this particular species of sort of experimental, experiential performance art, and by performance art alone, because I don't think painters yet have a way of doing this safely. It's a tendency to go physically to limits, to access immanence via the flesh, and experience, but just for a little while, the hysteria and absolute material visibility and presence. Thank you.